Hello and welcome to this edition of ZOUD, Zone of Uncomfortable Debate. And this is a space where we are daring to have difficult, challenging and open conversations about some of those sensitive issues playing out in society and more specifically in the workplace. Well, today we're asking menopause or men on pause. You know, this is a subject that is extremely close to my heart. I think I could actually be the poster child for this topic. And we know that the menopause, or the time, leading up to the menopause, can be such an intense and life-changing experience for many women who can suffer between mild to debilitating symptoms. And there's a lot of research out there, more is growing about what women can do to prepare, to go through, navigate through this whole period, and hopefully come out the other side better, stronger, healthier. But what about men? There's now a debate forming around men. Do men go through menopause? And if so, is this something that they would want to be categorized with? Would they be willing to talk about their symptoms? What do we know about men and the menopause? Well, joining me today to have what I think is going to be a very rich conversation are three amazing guests. Let me first introduce Michelle Jackson, who is a professional diversity and inclusion leader at Shaw Trust. Now, this woman is on fire in the diversity and inclusion space. I know that she has helped them to achieve the National Equality Standard in 2021. And in 2022, they were also the winners for the CIPD Best D&I Initiative at the People Manager Award. Wow. And I think she's going for a hat trick to get an award for being the most inclusive menopause friendly organization. So welcome, Michelle, and thank you for joining ZOUD.
Thank you so much, Sylvia.
And my next guest is a wonderful man called Dan Hubbard. Now, Dan is our regional operations director here at IC24. He's got this really nice background that shows some of our policies and our behavior and our culture. And Dan is he's a really busy man, and he spends time making sure that all of you who are watching can get the help and the support that you need when you need medical treatment. And he is wonderful around women. I always say that Dan is comfortable around women. And so I couldn't think of a better person to invite on to talk about menopause. So Dan, thank you for coming and being a part of ZOUD.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. And then last but not least, how can I describe her? Her name is Catherine Pitts, and she is the Chief Strategy and Transformation Officer. Now, I see this woman as the vein of our organization. She's what helps it to keep going, to evolve, to grow, and to really be of relevance to the communities. What I love about this woman, two things, is that she is a people person. She has got this contagious, bubbly attitude. She will tackle anything head on, and she'll do it in such a professional and sensitive way. And she's also my manager. I have to say, he's also my manager. So I want to welcome Catherine. Catherine, thank you for coming on ZOUD.
Thanks, Sylvia. I think we're really excited to be here, and thank you for hosting this really important subject for us all to really open up and discuss in a very different way. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So I'm going to go into this because before we went on air and I was talking to Dan, we were talking about, how difficult it can be to discuss menopause, even if you think about it from a generational perspective. So let me start out by asking you, what one word comes to mind when you hear the word menopause? And for those who are watching, and if you're on the chat, why don't you just put something in the chat? What is the one word that comes to mind when you hear the word menopause? I'm going to start out by asking Dan.
Women. That's the first word.
Yeah. And why do you say women?
Because I think from my perspective and growing up, it was always and has always been it's a woman's problem. It's not something that was ever discussed. If I was trying to keep you to one word, Sylvia, is always a difficult thing. But the other one would be for me is unknown. Because I don't really know anything about it. I mean, I've learned more in the last couple of years, but it was always deemed when I was growing up as a child, never knew my mum was going through it. And it was always seen as something that's never been talked about. I wasn't aware of it until, that first uncomfortable Brave Women's session for me a year or so ago when I walked into a discussion on menopause, and that's kind of triggered my interest and what we're doing around that as an employer, or even just as a man. And trying to understand that I have a wife, I have a daughter. They'll all equally go through this as well at some stage. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I do remember that very graphic meeting that you walked into, and you were just so natural about it. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear more about that. And Michelle, what's your one word and why?
Interesting, because I was trying to think of one word. What consolidates it all? I think change, actually, because when you're going through that period of menopause, a lot is also changing generally in your life. If you have children, it's a point where they're leaving home. If you have relatives still around, that's a point where they start to need a bit more support from you. So your world is full of change, and then in your body, you're going through changes as well. And as we know, lots of women leave the workplace due to menopause, so there could be a change even in terms of their financial situation as well. So it's a kind of a kind of holistic period of kind of change, really.
Yeah, and they do call it "I'm going through the change," don't they? They do say that, so that's a really apt word. Thank you so much, Michelle. And Catherine, what's your one word and why?
Old. No, I completely appreciate some women go through menopause at a really young, accelerated time. So clearly, I don't want to kind of not acknowledge that element. But for me, it is that sign of getting old.
Yeah. And how are you dealing with that, or how do you deal with that?
Well, I've never really been one to worry about the number of my age. So, but it is just that really sort of hit you in the face age thing where, you have your birthdays, and I love a birthday, as a lot of you will know. And so I've never been anxious about big birthdays, love a birthday with a 0 on the end. But the menopause word actually makes you realize that those zeros is an age thing. So for me, menopause is definitely that kind of, you're moving into a different stage of your life. And I think you're right, it's the change and everything else that everybody said. But for me, it's that acknowledgement that my body is aged.
Yeah. And I think as well, even if we try to ignore it, your body confirms it. That's the profound thing. Your body confirms it physically, and there's also that mental, that psychological aspect of coming to terms. I remember in one of the menopause drop-in centers sessions that we have, one of our colleagues was talking about accepting that they don't have the choice to have children anymore.
Mm.
You don't think about that. I mean, if you said, do you want another child? I'd say, no, but I want the choice to have the child. And you just don't have that. Any more on this, Michelle, in terms of that?
I was thinking about that as you were talking, actually. And I think a lot of us now at this stage of our life still feel vibrant, still feel they can go to clubs, they can listen to music. So we feel in our head younger, but actually our body has that sense check of you may feel younger, but physically you are getting older. And so trying to reconcile those two things is quite difficult, because I think initially we were all thinking, 40s, 70s, a new 40 and all this kind of stuff. And we felt that our previous generation didn't feel. We'd look at people our age when we were younger and they looked old to us. So we look at ourselves dressing quite young and being aware of what's happening in social media and so on. And then you kind of realise, actually, although you're able to keep your mind young and exercise and look after yourself, your body ages when it ages.
Yeah.
So I think coming to terms with that duality is often quite difficult as well, I think.
Yeah, Michelle, I'm always reminded, well, I think 50 is the new 30 until it's the morning after the night before.
Yeah.
And then I definitely don't feel like I'm 30 still.
Yeah. Yeah, okay at the time, but the recovery takes a bit longer.
So we've heard it's an unknown. It's definitely a time of change. It's that kind of acceptance that, you know, I'm getting old. So my next question is, so why do we really think that the menopause is such a taboo subject for women and men? I want us to go a little bit deeper in that. And I want to ask, is there a generational difference playing into this? So I was talking to Dan earlier and saying that my mom is 98, and I don't even know, did she know that she was going through the menopause? Did she know what was happening with her body? I'm not sure, especially from a cultural perspective. They definitely didn't talk about it. It was so not the done thing. And I wouldn't have felt confident or comfortable to say to mom, the menopause. I remember just very quickly when I reached my 40th birthday, I had all of my sisters and my mom in a room. And I said, look, I've reached 40. And so I just want to know what to expect for the menopause. And my mom said, what is that? Well, what is that? Really? What is that? My goodness. So I don't know whether she didn't know or she just accepted it as life. But what are your thoughts on that? Let me come to Catherine first. You know, why do you think menopause is such a taboo subject for women?
I still think it starts from the fact that so are periods.
Yes.
Now, if you couldn't talk about periods, you then can't talk about what happens when you actually move to the stage of your life when they stop, and it's all put into the same pot. And people still don't. I think it's certainly much better. I've got a 21-year-old and a 14-year-old. They talk about it endlessly. But previously, that wouldn't have happened. They're comfortable talking to their friends, and it's just really different. So I think we are still growing up. We're still in a generation that periods didn't get talked about. So if you couldn't talk about that, you certainly then couldn't make the jump to talk about menopause. So I think this is a education piece. As I say, I'm really happy my daughters are comfortable having conversations. It's not something that's hidden, but I would have been mortified if anybody knew I had a period. So if I couldn't talk about that, how on earth can I open up and talk about, oh God, they've gone, they're going. When I talked about them in the first place, I pretended I never had them. So I think this is wrapped up in so many stages of female development that is also visual and also uncomfortable. It goes back to a stage where you couldn't even play football as girls and boys because girls might have boobs. We are there's so much wrapped up in this conversation about why you can't talk about menopause. And if you can't, if you're from that generation, as I say, that couldn't even talk about puberty properly, then I think that's why we're here now. And I think that's why I still find it really odd when I see adverts about menopause. I was in Primark the other day and they have a whole menopause range of underwear. Now, I can't remember ever seeing that before. So we clearly have moved a long way in terms of helping younger generations feel more comfortable with changes and comfortable with what happens with their bodies. But I certainly think, I'm guessing 30-year-olds plus wouldn't have had that exposure. So therefore, to then expect everyone to sit comfortably talking about menopause is quite a jump.
I think so. And as you were talking, Catherine, I remember when I started my period, my mom kind of just took me in a back room, gave me a bag of bricks.
Yes. And don't talk about it ever again.
The ones that have the loop and the pins, and she just couldn't even look at me, you thinking, what's going on? And actually it were my oldest sisters that told me what was happening, because my mom, she just okay, and that was it. She didn't say anything about it. But then when my daughter, they started early, like 12 years old, having periods, they had it like a period party.
Yes,
And
it's
then-
very difficult. And I think it's because the older, a generation that hasn't been brought up with it being such a normal, right place of life. It was also not sexualized, but it became part of oh my goodness, you can now be pregnant. Therefore, the
Stay away from boys.
all of that comes in, and it was a difficult conversation. People aren't open to talk about that with young adults.
No, absolutely.
So for me, that's why this conversation is so difficult, because of all those
so
bits that are wrapped up in it.
Yeah, wonderful. Dan, my goodness, you're in the midst again. We're talking about periods and menopause. Dan, what are your thoughts? Why is this so difficult, especially from a man's point of view?
I mean, it is a generational thing, without a doubt. It's not something, Catherine's already covered it off, and it was something that was already going through my mind around the fact around periods. I have a wife who's 30, so I'm glad you picked that age, Catherine. And she equally doesn't hide it from me that it's something that's happening, but feels like it's not something I should see or get sight of, that's happening. I'm like, it's natural, it's absolutely fine. But it's again because as a child growing up, it's not something that is necessarily discussed and is treated as a bit of a secret, and therefore we have to expect that. And it's definitely, I think it's gradually leaving. It's something that is talked about now, doing this as we are now. That wouldn't have happened 15, 20 years ago necessarily. So I think the main driver for it is the fact that, and equally society, how it saw men and women, and what was there to be talked about. I've had this conversation with my mum, asked her about what it was like for her. And she said, luckily for her, she didn't have really bad symptoms and it was quite manageable. And I was like, did you ever speak to Dad about it? Oh God, no. That I couldn't mention it to him. And equally, his opinion is that's not my problem. That's something you deal with. I don't need to know about it. They're in their 70s now, and that's clearly even. I think my mum even feels a little uncomfortable talking to me about it. So it's definitely something to do with, I think, the idea it's something that should have been kept away as a secret. You don't need to talk about it. But I do think it was because, it is happening to women at that time. If it was a male issue, it would have probably been more out in the open. Quite possibly. I mean, we won't know. I mean, obviously, when we get to talk about the version of the male menopause, looking at, and I've never really something that I've ever considered or talked about myself, but I did Google. So let's just thought, okay, let's see what's said about it. And when you talk about some of the symptoms, I think equally men wouldn't talk about it either, because there are a lot of things, talking about depression, especially erectile dysfunction. I don't know many men that talk about that very openly. I think even men will. But then again, that's down to the fact, I think that's more about what men are like in terms of not being open and discussing, when they're having issues, whatever they are, very secretive about it. And so, I'm glad it's going in the right direction. And this is something that, I'm really keen on. So when I'm talking to my wife about it, and she's being a bit secretive about it, and don't come in, or I'm sorry, you might have seen a bloody tampon somewhere. Well, it's not the end of the world. I'll get over it. I said, but we've got a son and we've got a daughter. They need to know it's okay, both of them. So we've got to remember that, and we have to drive that. So it's not something weird. And my son Oscar finds the box of tampons quite regularly, and he thinks they're wonderful things to play with. So he's obviously already on that path.
Oh wow! And I just love what I love about your share there, Dan, is that you are being willing. You're being willing to have those conversations, even though your wife is not comfortable. And I think it's just so important to have those conversations. Go ahead, Michelle,
and then it's also a case of the way that we are socialized. So I think a lot of women are socialized to make people around them feel comfortable. So they're not like to raise any issues that they feel may cause discomfort. So that's something that we need to be aware of. And hopefully that's changing. And it's unfortunate that it's marketing that's kind of leading the way. They found a way to kind of monetize this. And so that's why there are menopause vitamins and menopause clothes and menopause everything now, menopause hair products. And I think that's what's leading the conversation to some extent. But interestingly enough, there are lots of cultures where they actually do celebrate, a young girl starting her period. So it's interesting that there are sort of cultural issues and situations that are different. One of the things that I was thinking about in terms of this also is the fact that previously there was a link between a woman going through menopause and her end of her working life. So it was almost as though we don't need to invest too much in this because actually there won't be a problem to society. They'll go home, they'll look after grandchildren. So it's not a kind of issue that employers would need to think about. And obviously now, because of the change in demographics, the extension to pension age and so on, the fact that we need to retain this demographic in the workplace, I think that's been a driver for lots of these discussions as well. So you could call me a cynic, but I think there's a marketing angle and then there's a kind of a retention issue in this as well. So, but it is interesting, isn't it? How, and I have a daughter who's 19 and she will talk quite openly. So it bodes well for the future, I think.
Yeah. I was going to say as well that there is something about being labelled, if you like, as menopausal. It does lend its way to ageism, I think. And that's why I think a lot of women would try to maintain their youth and try to look young, because as you said earlier, Michelle, we still feel fine, we still feel great. There may be some stuff happening with us, but I think a lot of organizations, and we'll talk about that in a bit, maybe miss the fact that there's stuff going on, and if they know that it's the menopause, maybe it's like, okay, I'm not going to give her the promotion, she won't be able to cope with the additional stress. She's having a lot of time off, she's not been in the office, she's wanting to work from home. So there's lots of, I think, bias that plays into that. So who wants to, put their hand up and say, yeah, I'm in the menopause group? No, we've got to create that real open, psychologically safe
safety.
Yeah, that trusted environment that I can be myself even through the change, and that I'm not going to be sidelined by that. I just wanted to then, before we go into organizations, just wanted to ask, and I'm going to start out with Catherine, what's been your personal then experience? So let's take you away from the working environment. And what's your personal experience with menopause, especially when it relates to life outside of the office?
Yeah. Some of you won't be surprised if I say I'm quite an irritating little sister. Just putting it out there before I say this next bit. So actually, I grew up with lots of females in terms of aunties around me, and they never spoke of this. They'd be mortified. They were still in kind of the mindset and generation who would put their makeup on before my uncles came home from work type thing. They certainly wouldn't be talking about menopause. So that, clearly you knew they'd gone through it, but it was never spoken about. But when my oldest sister started getting menopausal, well, I quite enjoyed telling her she was having a hot flush and had one of her rages on or something. So yeah, I took on the role of irritating little sister, pointing out her challenges that she was facing with her menopause. Well, when you're only 2 years behind, that soon comes and whacks you around the face. And I think she's quite enjoyed now seeing things happening in the other direction. So for me, it was really seeing how she all of a sudden was really noticing how she was feeling. And, she'd phone and she goes, oh, God, I'm in a rage. I'm just going to have to go for a walk. And I was like, that's fine. And, sort of, because we're very close. So seeing her kind of go through it, realizing at the time I was very unsupportive.
But did you get the support you needed?
Usually, but I think that's always been the role. So it was. I think it's very different when you have peers that have gone through it. So a lot of my friends have also in different stages of that, and I think that female network becomes even more important. Mainly because exactly what Dan said. I think Dan is one of our new breed men who is really comfortable. Certainly my husband, etc., very like Dan, wouldn't mind talking about it, but probably doesn't want to be sat in a room with all my friends talking about it. So I do think those networks of females work really well, whether it's in business or personally. Females need networks of other women. And I think certainly in menopause, I've seen that really pull together. So for me, my early sort of understanding menopause was done from a humorous angle. Of course, you need humour, but at some point, you realise that this is much more difficult than laughing every time I get my menopause fan out.
Yes.
And actually by just if I'm in social situations or at different events, and I will openly say I'm just getting my menopause fan, and it just kind of
it breaks it, doesn't it?
It does embrace it, and it also makes people then comfortable. There's nothing worse than sitting next to somebody who's having a hot, sweaty flush, thinking, "Oh God, is it menopause, or are they just about to keel on the floor?" It's actually quite helpful to have that humour. But yeah, so
do you think, Catherine? Do you think that's because by background you're a nurse, so you're used to dealing with this? Or do you think it genuinely is your personality, which I could see that you would be willing to talk about it?
I think clearly being a nurse, the background does help, without a doubt. And I think it also, and whether it's personality or training, that's a whole debate, isn't it? But knowing how you may impact somebody next to you, that's really important. Especially through this, because we don't all talk about it. If I sat next to a stranger having a hot flush, they may actually think I'm having a cardiac arrest. Not that I'm over dramatic, but you just kind of go, it's fine, and have a joke about it. So I think there is a place of humour. So my personal experience has been a balance of having friends who are either, and again, it does fit into that mood swing, they'll either be really struggling emotionally, or it'll be a really light-hearted humour interaction. And you actually, in an hour period, you can do both.
And the rest.
It's and that's why I think you need these close, trusted networks, personally or professionally. It's almost, there'll be different conversations, but females really need that, is mine. Yeah. I think, don't get me wrong, I think males do to a certain degree, but I think the research has shown how important those structures are for females in particular.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And Michelle, what's been your personal experience with menopause, sort of outside of the office?
So interestingly, talking about myself, actually, I had early onset menopause due to surgery. So I literally didn't have that support network around me. None of my friends or peers at the time were going through it, because obviously it was around the age of 40, so it was quite early. And I didn't feel confident enough to talk about it. So I didn't talk about it with my employer. And it's interesting listening to Catherine. I was an advisor at the time, so I'd be working in school giving somebody careers advice, then start to profusely sweat. So I was uncomfortable. They were uncomfortable. The whole situation was uncomfortable. So I'd sort of pat myself down, and then we'd carry on as if nothing had happened. But at that time, people were not talking about menopause, so I didn't feel comfortable enough to talk about it with my employer. I talk about it with my family, so I'd be driving along and the window would be up, the window would be down, the window would be up, the window would be down. But it's interesting, given that I'd been through this medical procedure, there was no support, no information for me, no explanation about what was likely to happen. I was just, the surgery's done, off you go. So I'm hoping that things will be different now. And the power of a peer support group, that's what we've got at Sure Trust now. And it's just a place where people can share their experiences. Quite often there's a lot of humour. There are tips. There are people doing exercise and yoga and sharing things that work for them. And I think it's just reassuring when you don't feel you're the only one, and there's somebody who absolutely gets it. And I think that's the kind of culture we're trying to create at Sure Trust, because not everybody does have a kind of a support network outside of work. They may not have friends. They may have friends who are going through different things and not the menopause. So at least we've created one place where you can have those conversations and feel that you're helping other people. But yeah, it was a complete shock. And looking back now, I think, how irresponsible not to have spoken to me about the fact that this could happen, So yeah, the people are going through things at different times, and you wouldn't necessarily know given their age as well.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was just thinking that I have many friends who didn't know that they were going through the menopause, but there's some fundamental psychological changes happening where they're feeling really, really angry about something, or feeling very weepy about something, and not really knowing. And I think that's probably the worst thing that can happen to anyone when you're feeling out of control. I think for me, when and it was actually brought on, Catherine says something about strangers. I went to get my nails done a few years ago now, and there was a lady in there, and she had this fan, and she started to talk about the change, and she started to talk about everything drying up, and I was like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean everything's drying up?
Please,
It was
no.
just, I thought, I normally come to get my nails done, and I normally like my piece. What do you do? What do you mean everything's drying up? And she was quite graphic, and I was like, oh my God. It was just such a shock. I'd never thought about it before. Hence me calling this whole conference with my family. Tell me what's going to happen to me. But some women go through some really, really bad experiences. I think for me, the worst one was definitely this sweating and brain fog. You're presenting, or you're in a conversation, somebody's looking at you quite intensely, and you think, my mind has been wiped clean. And I don't know what to say. So you mumble on, you say something that just doesn't make sense, and they nod, and it's really, really awkward. That was the worst thing. And then my second worst thing was definitely, mine wasn't flushes. I could have dealt with flushes. It was like somebody throwing a whole cup of water in my face. It'll be hanging down my chin.
And you can see people looking at you, and you're trying to think, oh, what should I do?
Yeah, and you're trying to put your makeup on, and you have to get the fan on, and is my face dry enough? And you put your makeup on, and it's just awful. And let's not talk about the weight gain. The menopause tire. So loads of people go through, but I think mine was really debilitating. And it was only when colleagues just said, Sylvia, I saw them talking, and then they said, get your life back, do your research. It took me 6 months to make up my mind, but I'm so glad I did, because I couldn't function. I could not function with lack of sleep. And I don't know how my husband put up with me. Catherine, by the way,
lots of those discussions actually, about people wanting to split up their relationship because they've turned into this new person, and they're not able to deal with their partners, really. We've had lots of those discussions actually, about people wanting to split up their relationship because they've turned into this new person, and they're not able to deal with their partners, really. So it affects you, and that's why I said change, because it can affect your relationships with family, friends, but also it's at the point where you're looking for progression within an organization, and then you doubt yourself because you think, well, what if I stand up and I have a brain fog moment? How are they going to take me seriously? So that's why a lot of women step back and think, I'm not capable. But it's the symptoms associated with menopause, is not the fact that they don't have that capacity intellectually. And so I just wonder about how many people have not progressed their careers, have really doubted themselves, or thought, okay, I better just work part-time, and how much society has missed out on all this talent because people have not been correctly diagnosed, or they weren't aware that they were going through the menopause. It's such a shame, because self-doubt is a terrible thing, isn't it? You can't progress and promote yourself if you're doubting yourself inside,
Yeah, and you think that everybody's seeing what you're seeing. Catherine, I was just going to ask you, and then Dan, I'm going to ask if you've got anything to add on this before we move on to organizations. Did menopause affect your relationships, when you're going through?
From my perspective, not really at all, actually. But I think I've only just started, so you might need to ask me that in 18 months, Sylvia.
I can write the book for you.
Get your husband on.
Oh, no.